You want to know the single dumbest thing I ever saw three soldiers do? I'll tell you. They killed an old man's dog. That's it, that's the whole crime. They didn't blow up a city. They didn't break a treaty in some grand chamber with cameras watching. They walked into a quiet little supply yard on a quiet little way station at the edge of nowhere, and they killed a brown dog with a gray muzzle, and they laughed about it, and then they went to get a drink. I was standing maybe 20 paces away when it happened. I had a crate of pressure seals in my arms and I dropped every one of them. I still remember the sound they made hitting the deck. I remember it better than I remember my own mother's voice, if you want the truth, and I'm not proud of that, but that's how it is when you live long enough. Some sounds get burned in. My name doesn't matter much for this. I'm a Velt. We're small. We're soft. We have these long fingers good for sorting and counting and not much else, and we have a reputation across 6 systems for being the people you hire when you need a thing logged and shelved and forgotten. I logged things. I shelved them. I'd worked that way station Howard Reach, we called it, though humans called it the Reach, and the Corthan called it nothing because the Corthan didn't bother nomming places they intended to own. I'd worked there 9 years by then. I knew every bolt in that floor. So when I tell you I never saw a thing like the old man, believe me, because I had nothing to compare him to. And neither did the 3 who killed his dog. That was the problem. Nobody on that station knew what they were looking at, including me. Including, I think sometimes, the old man himself, until they made him remember. Let me back up. Let me do this right. You can't understand the end if you don't sit with the beginning, and the beginning is slow and ordinary, and I love it for that. Howard Reach was a rust-colored hub bolted into the side of a dead asteroid, hanging in a system nobody wanted because it had no star worth the word. We had a brown dwarf, a sulky little ember of a thing that gave us a dull orange light through the dome windows and not much heat, so the whole station ran warm-blooded on its own reactors, and the windows always had that amber glow like the inside of a lamp burning low. Freighters came through to refuel and trade and gossip. 3 species lived there in any number, us Velt, the Elish Sumaro who ran the water and the wiring, and a scatter of independent humans who drifted out past the proper colonies and never drifted back. Corthan came and went. Corthan came and went everywhere in those years. They had ships and pride and an empire that was still hungry even after it had eaten most of what it wanted. And they treated stations like the Reach the way you'd treat a cup you intended to drink from, and then put down without washing. The old man ran the supply yard on the 3rd ring. Renner, his name was. Caleb Renner. Most folks just called him Cal or Old Cal or the Dog Man, which is funny now, isn't it, that we all knew him by his dog before we knew anything else. He was a human, obviously, but he was an old one, and humans don't all age the same, so let me paint him for you. He was tall, but he'd given up some of it to a stoop, the kind a man gets from years of bending under low ceilings and over heavy work. His hair was white and he kept it short, military short, though none of us thought anything of that at the time because lots of drifters keep their hair short. It's easier in space. His hands were enormous and scarred and slow. He had a face like a riverbed in the dry season, all cracks and patience, and pale eyes that didn't blink much. He spoke soft. He spoke so soft you'd lean in, and then you'd realize you'd leaned in, and you'd wonder why a man that big needed to talk that quiet to make you do it. And he had Otis. Otis was a dog, a real one, earth-born stock, which on a station like the Reach was about as rare as a fresh apple. Big brown thing, deep in the chest, with a gray muzzle and a left ear that flopped while the right stood up, so he always looked like he was halfway through asking you a question. He was old like Cal was old. The 2 of them moved at the same speed, which was no speed at all, a kind of slow tide in and out of the yard every day. Otis would lie in the doorway of the supply office in that amber light, and thump his tail twice when anyone he liked walked by, and once for anyone he tolerated, and not at all for the Corthan, who he watched with a low, steady look that never became a growl but never relaxed either. I got 2 thumps. I was proud of those 2 thumps. I'm a grown Velt with more years behind me than ahead, and I'm telling you I used to detour past that office on my route just to get them. Here's the thing about Cal Renner that everyone knew and nobody understood. He was kind in a way that made you nervous. You've met kind people, soft ones. The kind whose kindness is a sort of weakness, a leaking thing, a person who can't say no and so says yes to their own ruin. Cal wasn't that. Cal's kindness was the opposite. It felt chosen. It felt like a thing he did on purpose every single day, the way other men lift weights, and you got the sense, I don't know how to say this without sounding foolish, you got the sense that if he ever stopped choosing it, you would very much want to be somewhere else. I'll give you an example. There was a Sumaro kid, barely grown, who got himself in deep with a freighter crew over a gambling debt. Bad crew. The kind that collect with knives. They came to the Reach to settle it, and they cornered the kid in the third-ring concourse, and a crowd gathered the way crowds do, all of us useless, all of us watching, none of us moving. And Cal walked through that crowd with Otis at his knee, and he didn't shout and he didn't draw anything because he never carried anything. And he just stood between the kid and the crew, and he said soft, "You understand that soft voice," he said. "He's going to pay you. I'll stand for it. But not today and not like this." And the crew leader, who was a big Corthan-blooded half-breed with a temper, he looked at this old human standing there with a gray dog and empty hands, and you could see the calculation run across his face. You could see him add it up. Old, unarmed, alone, nothing. And then you could see him get to the bottom of the sum and not like the answer and not know why he didn't like it. He took the credits Cal offered. He took less than he was owed. And he left, and afterward he couldn't have told you why. That was Cal. He could end a thing without touching it. We thought it was wisdom. We thought it was age. We didn't know it was practice. The dog was the part of him that wasn't careful. That's what I figured out later, much later, lying awake. The kindness was a discipline, a held breath, a hand kept open by force of will. But the dog was just love, plain and stupid and total, the one place the old man let himself off the leash. He talked to that dog all day. He'd carry on whole conversations, low and easy, asking Otis his opinion on the day's manifest, telling him which freighter captains were liars. He cooked for him, actual cooking, scrounged protein and a little fat, because the kibble that came through trade was junk, and Cal said Otis had earned better. At night the dog slept across the office doorway, and Cal slept in a cot behind the counter, and if you came by late, you'd see the old man's hand hanging off the cot in the dark, resting on the dog's flank, both of them breathing slow in that orange light, 2 old soldiers who'd found a quiet place to put down their weight. I say 2 old soldiers. I didn't know that's what they were, I just thought it. Some things you know before you know them. Now the Corthan. You have to understand what the Corthan were in those years, because every story needs a weather, and they were ours. They were big, a head and a half taller than a tall human, plated across the shoulders and skull with a kind of natural armor that shaded from slate to near black with age and rank. They had 4 eyes set in 2 pairs, which made them very hard to lie to and very easy to hate, because there's something about being looked at by 4 eyes at once that tells your body, on a level below thinking, that you are prey. They were strong. They were fast for their size, and they had been winning for a long, long time. That's the part people forget. The Corthan weren't villains in their own story. They were victors. They had spread across a third of the charted systems by simply arriving somewhere, deciding it was theirs, and being correct often enough that everyone stopped arguing. They didn't hate the species they absorbed. Hate takes effort. They simply didn't see them as fully real. We were scenery to them. We were the furniture of a galaxy they were redecorating. You can't insult furniture. You can only move it or break it, and the Corthan did both without much feeling either way. They'd fought the humans, of course. Everyone knew that. The subjugation war, it was called in the records, though humans had another name for it that they didn't say out loud. It had ended a long time before my story, before the Reach, before Otis was even a pup. It had ended, and the official truth, the truth in the trade school readers and the treaty stones and the polite conversation, was that it had ended in a negotiated peace. The Korthan and the humans had fought, and it had been terrible. And then wise heads had prevailed, and a treaty was signed, and the killing stopped. And now we all lived in the same galaxy, and traded and tolerated each other, and that was that. That was the official truth. The Korthan believed a different one. They believed they had won. They believed the humans had fought hard, harder than expected, embarrassingly hard for a young species, but that in the end the Korthan had brought them to heel and granted them a generous peace out of magnanimity, and that the humans you met out in the world, drifters, traders, colonists, were the leftovers of a beaten people, scattered and quiet and grateful to be alive. And the humans didn't say what they believed. That's the thing. In all my 9 years on the Reach, I never once heard a human correct a Korthan about that war. Not once. They'd just go quiet. They'd get this look. I saw it on Cal 100 times before I understood it. This look like a man listening to someone describe a death they were present for badly and choosing not to fix the details. I should have wondered about that. Why a beaten people would be so calm. Why the losers never flinched. The three who killed Otis came in on a Korthan patrol cutter called the Hollow Crown, which tells you something about them right there. Because patrol cutters were crewed by the young and the bored and the recently promoted, the ones still hungry to be seen being Korthan. There were more than 3 aboard, but 3 are the ones who matter. Their leader was a slate-shouldered male named Vorik, second or third generation off the homeworld, the kind who'd grown up on stories of the war and resented having been born too late for it. Beside him was a leaner one called Daleth who laughed too easily and too long, the way nervous people do when they want a strong friend to like them. And there was a big silent one whose name I never learned, plated dark, older than the other 2, who I think now understood more than he ever let on, and who I have never been able to forgive for his silence. Because of all of them, he was the one who might have stopped it. They came into the supply yard on the 3rd day of their stay in the late shift when the Reach was quiet and the brown dwarf burned low and most of the dock was asleep. They came because they were bored. That's all. They weren't sent. There was no order, no plan, no reason a court could later point to. They were 3 young soldiers far from home with too much strength and nothing to spend it on, and they wandered into the one place on the station with anything warm in it. And they found an old human and his dog asleep in a doorway in the orange light. I was there because I couldn't sleep. I want that on the record. Of all the nights for me to be doing inventory in the back of the third-ring stores, it was that one. I've thought about that a lot. If I'd slept, I wouldn't be telling you this. Somebody else would, badly, or nobody would, and Otis would just be a thing that happened in the dark and got swept up and forgotten, and the rest of it might never have happened at all, because maybe nobody would have lit the match. I don't know. I've gone around and around it. I'll go around it the rest of my life. What I saw was this. Vorik had a bottle. They'd been drinking the cheap Sumaro spirit that strips paint and judgment in equal measure, and they came down the ring loud, knocking over a stack of empty crates outside the yard just to hear them fall, and the noise woke Otis. The old dog lifted his gray head from the doorway and looked at them. Just looked. He didn't bark. Cal, behind the counter on his cot, stirred but didn't rise, the way you don't rise for a sound your dog will handle. Otis stood up, slow, stiff, the way old dogs do, getting the back legs sorted out under him. And he walked out into the ring and stood in front of the office doorway between the Korthan and the sleeping man, and he held his ground. Gray muzzle, one ear up, one ear down. He didn't growl. He just stood there, this old brown animal, 20 kilos of it maybe, planting himself in front of 3 of the deadliest creatures the galaxy had ever made. I think that's what set Vorik off, honestly. Not anger. Insult. Here was a thing, a small, soft beast, that had decided to stand in his way. To Vorik, that wasn't a dog being loyal. That was the furniture refusing to be moved. Daleth laughed, that long, nervous laugh. Said something I didn't catch. Vorik answered him in Korthan, and the big silent one said nothing, and then Vorik reached down to his hip and unclipped his sidearm. I want to tell you I shouted. I want to tell you I ran. I didn't. I stood in the dark of the stores with a counting stylus in my long, soft fingers, and I froze, the way prey freezes, the way my whole species has frozen for 10,000 years, because freezing is how we lived long enough to be furniture. Otis didn't freeze. He never moved at all. He just kept standing there in the doorway, in the orange light, between the men and the thing they wanted, the way he'd stood between the world and Cal every night for I don't know how many years, the way it was simply his whole entire job to do. Vorik shot him. It wasn't a fight. I need you to understand, it wasn't even a moment. It was nothing. The bolt was bright and short, and the sound it made was almost polite, a little spitting crack, and Otis dropped where he stood without a single sound of his own, and the smell of it reached me a second later across the dark, and that was the end of the dog. That fast. A whole life, all that loyalty, all those slow mornings, all that love the old man poured into him, ended in less time than it takes to say it. Daleth laughed again. The big silent one looked away, and Vorik holstered his weapon and stepped over the body, actually stepped over it into the doorway, and he kicked the leg of the cot, and he said in trade tongue, loud and slurred and pleased with himself, "Get up, old furniture. Your animal's making a mess." And in the dark of the stores, 20 paces away, I watched the old man wake up. Now here is where I have to slow down, because what happened next I have replayed more times than any other thing in my life, and I still can't get it to move at the speed it actually moved. In my memory, it's slow. Everything's slow. I think that's because some part of me understood, in that exact instant, that I was watching the floor of the world tilt, and the mind stretches a moment like that out long so you can survive carrying it. Cal Renner sat up on the cot. He didn't lunge. He didn't shout. He sat up the way a man sits up any morning, slow, swinging his legs over, and he looked down at the doorway, at the brown shape lying in it, at the gray muzzle and the one ear that would never stand up again, and he was quiet. He was so quiet. He reached down and he put one of his enormous scarred hands on the dog's side, the way he did every night in the dark, and he held it there a moment, feeling for the breathing that wasn't going to come. And then he looked up at the 3 soldiers in his doorway. I have tried for a long time to describe the old man's face in that moment, and I've never gotten it. People want me to say it was full of rage. It wasn't. People want me to say he wept. He didn't, not then. What I saw on Caleb Renner's face when he looked up from his dead dog at the 3 Corthan who'd killed it was, and I know how this sounds, it was relief. A terrible, settling, bone-deep relief. Like a man who has been holding something heavy over his head for 30 years, holding it because to put it down would break everything beneath, and who has just been told by someone else that he's allowed to let go now, that it's not his choice anymore, that they made the choice for him. He looked at them for a long moment with that face. Vorik, still grinning, swaying a little, Daleth's laugh dying in his throat as the silence stretched, the big silent one already, I think, beginning to understand. Then the old man spoke, in that soft, soft voice that made you lean in. He said, "Do you know what I did before this?" And Vorik, who was young and drunk, and had never in his life been afraid of anything smaller than himself, laughed and said, "Hauled crates, old furniture. Same as tomorrow." And Cal Renner looked down at his dog one more time, and he stroked the gray muzzle once with his thumb, and he said, and I heard it, I was 20 paces away and I heard every word, "I will hear it until I die." He said, "No, before that." He stood up, and the lights of Howard Reach all across the 3rd ring flickered once, like the station itself had drawn a breath. I didn't understand what I'd just seen. None of us did, not yet. I only knew that the air had changed, the way it changes before the dome vents a pressure wash, that low pull in the chest. I only knew that the old man was standing in his doorway over his dead dog with his huge hands hanging open at his sides, looking at 3 armed soldiers as though they were a chore he'd been putting off, and that for the first time in 9 years, his kindness was nowhere on his face. The big silent Corthan put a hand on Vorik's shoulder, the first thing he'd done all night. He said one word in Corthan, low and fast, and I didn't know the word then, but I learned it later. It meant run. Vorik shook the hand off and laughed. That, I think, was the last mistake any of them got to make for free. I need to tell you something about fear before I go on, because the rest of this story is made out of it. And if you don't understand Corthan fear, you won't understand what happened on the third ring of Halward Reach. The Corthan didn't feel fear the way I do, the way you probably do. For me, fear is a held breath, a freezing, a smallness, I told you. It's how my people lived. For the Corthan, fear was almost a foreign substance. They'd bred it out of themselves over 1,000 generations of winning. A young Corthan could go his whole life and never feel it, not once, not really. The way a man born by a calm sea might never learn to swim because the question never comes up. They had a word for it, but it was an old word, a story word, the kind of thing grandmothers used. It wasn't a thing that happened to them. So when I tell you that the big silent Corthan was afraid, when I tell you that he put his hand on Vorik's shoulder and said the word that meant run, I'm telling you something close to a miracle. I'm telling you that somewhere in that big dark soldier's memory, something ancient had woken up and recognized the old man in the doorway. Not the face, the kind. The way a deer that has never seen a wolf will still, the first time, somehow know. Vorik didn't have that. Vorik was too young and too drunk and had grown up too safe. He shook the hand off and he laughed, and he turned back to the old man, and he made the last free mistake of his life. He raised his sidearm again, the same one, still warm, and he pointed it at Caleb Renner's chest, and he said, loud for his friends, "Sit down, furniture, before you join your..." He didn't finish it. I want to be careful here, because this is the part nobody believes, and I've stopped trying to make them. I'll just tell you what I saw and you can do with it what you like. The old man crossed the doorway. That's the only way I can say it. I didn't see steps. I've thought about it, and I cannot give you the steps. One moment Caleb Renner was standing over his dog with his hands at his sides, 4 paces back inside the office. The next he was out in the ring, past the muzzle of Vorik's gun, which is a thing that should not be possible, because a gun is faster than a man. Everyone knows a gun is faster than a man, except I learned that isn't quite true. A gun is faster than a man's body. It is not faster than a man's whole life of deciding, in advance, exactly what he will do the day someone finally points one at him. Cal had decided that day a long time before. He'd just been waiting for someone to schedule it. He took the gun. He didn't wrestle it. He took it the way you'd take a cup from a child, a small turning motion, and there was a wet sound from Vorik's hand that I felt in my own fingers across 20 paces. And then the old man was holding the weapon and Vorik was holding a hand that bent the wrong way and making a sound I'd never heard a Corthan make. And here is the thing. Here is the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing that tells you who Cal Renner was better than any record ever could. He didn't use the gun. He had it. It was in his hand. 3 drunk soldiers, one of them already broken. The cold, easy thing would have been 3 bright spitting cracks and an end to it, and nobody on the reach would have shed a tear, and I'd be telling you a much shorter and much uglier story. He had the gun and he looked at it for half a second with something like disgust, and then he reached out with his other hand and he crushed it. Just closed his fist around the body of the weapon, and the casing folded like wet paper, and something inside it popped and the whole thing went dead. And he let the ruined pieces fall on top of his dog, and that was the most frightening thing he did all night, and he hadn't even touched anyone yet. Because do you understand what that told them? It told them the gun was beneath him. It told them he wasn't going to need it. It told 3 Corthan soldiers, 3 members of the species that had never lost, that the old furniture had looked at the deadliest tool any of them carried and decided it was clutter. That's when Daleth ran. Daleth, the one who laughed too easily, he turned and he bolted up the ring toward the lift, and he was fast. Corthan are fast, and I thought for half a heartbeat that he'd make it, and that some of this would be smaller than it was about to be. He didn't make it. I won't tell you exactly what the old man did because honestly I didn't see all of it, and the parts I saw I've tried to forget. I'll only say that Cal didn't chase him far, and that it was over very quickly, and that when it was done the old man wasn't even breathing hard, and that Daleth never laughed again. Two left. The big silent one who hadn't moved, who had said run and watched nobody listen. And Vorik on his knees now, cradling his ruined hand, his 4 eyes wide and wet and finally, full of the thing his species had bred away. He'd found it, the old word, the grandmother word. It had found him in a rusty supply yard at the edge of nowhere, and it had his name. The old man walked back to him, slow, that slow tide. He stood over Vorik and he looked down at him, and the orange light caught the side of his cracked riverbed face, and I swear to you I could see now all the things I'd never let myself see before. The way he stood, the way his weight settled, the stillness. I'd thought it was age, it was readiness. It had always been readiness. The old man had been standing like a drawn bow for 9 years, and I'd thought he was tired. And he asked Vorik the question again, the same one, soft. Do you know what I did before this? And Vorik, weeping now, this proud young soldier of the species that owned a third of everything, looked up at the old human and shook his head because he didn't know. He genuinely didn't know. None of them ever knew. That was the whole tragedy of it. That's when the big silent one finally spoke. To Vorik. In trade tongue so the old man could hear, and I think that was on purpose. I think he wanted Cal to know that he knew, that one of them had been smart enough or old enough or afraid enough to know, as if that might buy something. He said, "You fool, you absolute fool. Look at his hands. Look at the scars on his hands. That's an ash mark, every one of them. He's a quiet man." And the air went out of the ring. Now I have to stop and teach you something, the way it was taught to me later in pieces, by people who only half wanted to say it. Because quiet man meant nothing to me that night. I'd never heard it. It wasn't in any reader. The humans never said it, and the Korthan only said it the way you say the name of a thing in a dark you're afraid of. The subjugation war, the real one, the one under the treaty stones, it didn't end the way the school books say. The Korthan came for humanity the way they'd come for everyone, expecting scenery, expecting furniture. And for the first 2 years it went the way it always went. Humans lost. Humans lost badly. Worlds fell. The Korthan were stronger and faster, and they'd been winning since before humanity had writing. But humans did a thing that no species the Korthan had ever swallowed had done. They studied it. While they were losing, they studied losing. They studied the Korthan the way they'd once studied weather and disease and every other thing too big to fight head-on. And they found the seam. Every undefeated thing has a seam. A place where its strength is also its blindness, and the Korthan's seam was this. They had no fear, and a creature with no fear has no imagination for the dark. So humanity built the dark. They built soldiers, not many, never many. That was the point, soldiers trained to do the one thing the Korthan could not conceive of, to come alone, to come quiet, to slip past the great war fleets and the plated legions and walk into the places the Korthan thought were safe. The inner worlds, the home gardens, the council chambers, the nurseries of admirals, the bedchambers of warlords, and to not announce themselves, and to not demand surrender, and to simply, silently, undo whatever they'd been sent to undo, and be gone before the lights came up. No fleets, no banners, no warning, just a quiet that arrived and a quiet that left, and in between an empty space where something powerful used to be. The Korthan, who had no fear and so no word for this, made one. They called these humans the quiet men, and they marked them in their own records with a symbol that meant, roughly, the dark that chooses. And after the 3rd year of the war, when 11 of their 12 highest warlords had been found cold in rooms that nobody had entered and nobody had left, the Korthan, the species that had never lost, sued for peace. That's the real treaty. The official truth says wise heads prevailed. The Korthan truth says they won and were generous. Both are lies told to let everyone keep their pride. Here is what happened. A handful of quiet human beings walked into the safest places in the Korthan Empire and made it understood without ever raising their voices that there was no safe place, that there had never been a safe place, that the humans could reach anyone, anywhere, anytime, and had simply been choosing not to. And the Korthan, faced for the first time in their history with a fear they had no defense against, did the only thing left. They stopped. And the humans, this is the part that I think about most, the humans let them. The quiet men could have kept walking. There were no fleets to stop them. They could have gone all the way in to the homeworld, to the cradle, and ended the Korthan as a people, and no force in the galaxy could have raised a hand to prevent it. And they didn't. They stopped at the edge of the fire and they put the treaty stones down and they went home, or they went quiet, or they scattered out into the systems and ran supply yards and refused to carry weapons and poured all their love into a single old brown dog. And they let the Korthan keep believing they'd won. Because, and a human told me this once, much later, and I've never gotten over it, because the whole point of being able to end the world is being able to choose not to. That's the only thing that makes the rest of it bearable. The condition of the treaty, the one condition the Korthan demanded, the one thing their pride needed was that the quiet men be disbanded, erased, declared extinct. Humanity agreed. They agreed easily, suspiciously easily, and signed it, and the quiet men vanished from every record, and the galaxy was told they'd never really existed, that they were a horror story the Korthan told to explain a war they'd actually won. But you can't disband a thing like that. You can only retire it. You can only send it out into the quiet and ask it, please, for all our sakes, to stay kind, to choose every single day for the rest of its long life to keep its hands open, to run a supply yard, to pay a Sumaro kid's gambling debt, to talk to a dog. Caleb Renner was the last living quiet man, the very last. And for 30 years he had kept the treaty, kept it in his own body, with his own held breath, choosing mercy every morning the way you choose to keep holding a door shut against a flood. And the one thing on the whole rusty station that had made all that holding worth doing, the one warm reason he'd had to keep choosing, was a gray-muzzled old dog who slept across his doorway and thumped his tail twice for a soft little Velt clerk who couldn't sleep. And 3 bored boys had just shot it for fun. The big silent Korthan understood all of this. That's why he'd said run. And now, having said the words out loud, he's a quiet man. He did the only honorable thing left to him, which was that he didn't run himself. He stood very still, 4 eyes steady, and he looked at the old man and he said, quiet now, almost gentle, the way you speak to a force of nature you've accepted you can't outlast. It was him, the young one, not the patrol, not the empire, just him. The treaty holds, take him and let it hold. He was asking Cal to keep the peace. 30 years of peace. The whole architecture of the galaxy, balanced on whether one old man, standing over his murdered dog at the edge of nowhere, would do the careful thing or the human thing. And Cal Renner looked at the big honorable soldier who tried to warn his friend, and you could see him weighing it. You could see 30 years of discipline come up out of him one more time, that held breath, that open hand. You could see the quiet man and the dog man both alive in that cracked face at once, at war with each other. The one who'd put the treaty stones down at the edge of the fire, and the one who just felt a heartbeat stop under his palm. He looked down at Otis. He looked back up. And in that soft, soft voice that made you lean in, the voice the whole galaxy had once stopped a war to never hear coming, the old man said, the treaty was about not ending your world. He took a step toward Vorik. It never said anything about one boy. The lights of Howard Reach flickered a second time, and the big silent Korthan closed his 4 eyes and bowed his plated head, and did not move to stop what came next, because he understood, as the boy on his knees did not, that some debts are not paid to empires. Some debts are paid to a dog. I told you the moment slowed down. This is where it slowed the most. The old man took his step toward Vorik, and the whole ring held its breath, me in the dark of the stores, the big silent soldier with his head bowed, the station itself with its low orange light. And I was sure. I want you to know how sure I was. I was sure I was about to watch the last quiet man do the quiet thing one final time, and I was sure the boy had earned it, and I was even, and I'm ashamed of this, I was even glad. Some small, ugly part of me, the part that had frozen in the dark, the part that had watched Otis stand his ground while I dropped my crates, that part wanted to see the old man finish it, wanted someone to pay the whole bill at once. Cal Renner reached down and took Vorik by the front of his armor and lifted him. Lifted a full-grown Korthan soldier off his knees one-handed, the way you'd lift a sack you meant to set on a shelf, and held him there, the boy's feet not quite touching the deck, the boy's 4 eyes streaming, the boy's ruined hand clutched against his chest. And the old man looked at him from a hand's width away, and Vorik looked back, and there was nothing between them anymore. No armor, no empire, no 30 years of pretending. Just an old man who'd lost the last thing he loved and a young one who'd taken it without even knowing what he was taking. And the old man looked at him for a long, long time. I watched the storm move across that cracked riverbed face. I watched the dog man and the quiet man fight it out for what felt like the length of a life. And I understood right then, with Vorik hanging in the old man's fist, that this was the real war, not the one in the treaty stones, not the fleets and the legions. This, one old man deciding whether the worst thing that had ever happened to him got to become the worst thing he had ever done. Whether the dog who'd spent his whole gray-muzzled life teaching Cal how to be gentle was going to die having failed at the one lesson, or having finally, completely, won. The old man set Vorik down. He set him down on his feet gently, and he steadied him so the boy wouldn't fall, and he stepped back, and the held breath of the whole ring came out at once. He'd stopped at the edge of the fire. Of course he had. That was what a quiet man was. I'd had it backwards the whole night. We all had, the whole galaxy had, for 30 years. We thought the terror of the quiet men was what they could do. It wasn't. Anyone can kill. The terror of the quiet men was what they could do and chose not to. They were the dark that chooses, and the choosing was the whole of it. The choosing was the thing that had ended the war, because a creature that can end your world and decides, every single time at the very edge, to put it down, that is a thing more frightening than any weapon, because you cannot bargain with it and you cannot frighten it and you cannot ever, ever earn its restraint. You can only receive it, as a gift, from someone who owes you nothing and spares you anyway. But he wasn't finished. Don't think mercy meant nothing happened. Mercy is not the same as letting a thing go. He held Vorik by the back of the neck, not hard, just enough. And he turned the boy to face the doorway, to face the brown shape lying in the orange light with the gray muzzle and the one ear that would never stand again. And he made him look. He made him look at Otis for a long time. And then in that soft voice with his mouth close to the boy's head, he told him everything, the war, the quiet men, the 11 warlords cold in rooms nobody entered, the homeworld he could have reached and chose not to, the treaty, the 30 years of holding. He poured the whole hidden truth of the galaxy into one drunk, broken, weeping boy soldier, and at the end of it he said, "You're going to live. You're going to go home with your hand like that, and they're going to ask you what happened, and you're going to tell them, all of it. You're going to be the one who remembers. You're going to spend the rest of your life being the Korthan who knows. And when your people start to forget again, and they will, they always do, that's the whole trouble with your kind, you're going to be the one who looks at the next young fool reaching for his sidearm in a quiet place, and you're going to put your hand on his shoulder and you're going to tell him what's real. You're going to do the thing he did." He nodded at the big silent one who had not moved, who had bowed his head. "And maybe he'll listen where you didn't. That's your debt, not your life. Your life is easy. I'm giving you something heavier." And then, and this is the part I tell when people ask me why I still believe in anything, the old man let the boy go, and he turned his back on him. Turned his whole back, on an armed soldier of the species that had killed his dog, and walked away from him to the doorway, and knelt down in the orange light, and gathered the body of Otis up into his arms. Gathered him up the way you'd lift a sleeping child you didn't want to wake. And he held him, and at last, only then, with his back to everyone and his face down in the gray fur, the old man wept. I have heard a lot of sounds in my long, soft life. That one I keep separate from the others. I don't take it out often." Varek didn't move. The big silent one didn't move. Nobody moved. And after a while the old man stood, with the dog in his arms, and he carried him out of the ring and down toward the lower decks where the airlocks were, and the two Korthans stood aside to let him pass, and the big one bowed his plated head as the old man went by. Lo, the bow you give a thing far above your rank, and Vorek tried to do the same and couldn't, because he was shaking too hard, so he just sank back down to his knees in the place where it happened and stayed there. That's the last I saw of any of it that night. I finally moved. I crept out of the dark of the stores on my soft, useless feet, and I gathered up the crushed pieces of the gun and the spilled crates, because I'm a Velt and we tidy. We tidy when we don't know what else to do. And I cleaned the orange-lit ring until there was no sign anything had happened there at all, except the place on the deck where a dog had lain, which I couldn't seem to clean no matter how I tried, and which I think was just in my eyes. Here's how it ended, the ordinary way, the way real things end, not the way stories do. The Hollow Crown left 2 days later, quietly. Daleth was listed as lost to a depressurization accident which fooled no one and was questioned by no one. Vorek went home with a hand the medics couldn't fully fix, and a story he wasn't supposed to tell, and he told it anyway. I know he told it because of what happened afterward across the years, in 100 quiet places I never visited. The way the Korthan, who had been forgetting, slowly remembered. The way young soldiers in far supply yards started to feel a hand on their shoulder and a low word in their ear. The way the fear came back, gently like a tide, and with the fear came the peace, because for the Korthan the two had always been the same thing. One broken boy receded the dark across a third of the galaxy, and the treaty stones held for another generation, and not one ship had to fire to do it. That was the human win. That was always the human win, not the dark itself. The choosing. And one old man choosing at the very edge, to teach instead of to end. Cal Renner stayed on the Reach another 3 years. He ran the supply yard the same as ever, slow tied in and slow tied out, soft voice, open hands. He never got another dog. People offered. Traders came through with pups, good stock, expensive, and they'd give them to him for nothing just to be the one who gave old Cal a dog, and he always thanked them, and he always said no. I asked him about it once near the end, when I'd known the truth a while and we'd stopped pretending I didn't. I asked him why he wouldn't take another. He was quiet for a long time the way he got. Then he said, "A dog like that you don't replace. You just be asking a new one to be the old one, and that's not fair to anybody. Otis did his whole job. Every day of his life he stood between me and the worst of myself, and the one night he couldn't, the one night I was the worst of myself, I stopped at the edge, for him, because he taught me how." He looked at me with those pale, unblinking eyes. "I'm not going to ask another animal to carry that. He carried it fine. He carried all of it. He just looked like a dog while he did it. He died on the Reach in the orange light in the cot behind the counter, old age and nothing more, which for a man who could have ended a world is a kind of victory I still don't have the size to understand. I was there. He'd asked me to be, in his soft way, weeks before, like asking a friend to help move a heavy thing. At the end, his enormous scarred hand hung off the edge of the cot in the dark, the way it used to, resting in the empty space on the floor where a dog had slept for so many years, and I sat beside him, and I put my long, useless, soft fingers under his palm so he'd have something to rest his hand on, and he let me, and that was the last kindness either of us did for the other. I'm old now myself, older than I ever expected to get for a Velt. I've told this story 100 times, and most who hear it don't believe the big parts and believe all the small ones, which is exactly backwards, and I've stopped minding. I tell it anyway. I tell it because somebody should remember what the galaxy decided to forget, that the most dangerous thing the universe ever made spent the last 30 years of its life choosing, every single morning, to be gentle, and that the only thing that made all that gentleness possible, the one warm reason, was an old brown dog with a gray muzzle and one ear up and one ear down, who stood his ground in a doorway against 3 of the deadliest creatures ever born, and didn't even growl. People ask me what the old man really was. The quiet man, the last of them, the dark that chooses, the end of the war that nobody won. I tell them the same thing every time. He was the man who could have ended everything, and didn't. And you want to know who taught him how to not. You want to know who stood between this whole galaxy and the worst night it never had. A dog. Just a dog. They killed him for fun, and they never once realized what they put their hands on. And that right there is the truest thing I know about how the universe works. The most important things in it are always the ones that look the smallest, lying quiet in a doorway in the low orange light, asking the world a question with one ear up and one ear down, and waiting, patient and unafraid, to be loved enough to be worth all that mercy.